A thoroughly amateur production. If you look at this and think I'm not thoroughly amateur, I wonder what you're thinking. As you can see, I'm even trying to adjust the lighting while I'm making the video. I am an amateur. I'm a beginner in whiskey. That's why this channel, Whiskey for Beginners, if I wanted to go on and complete it, it would be by a beginner. Because what I'm trying to do is convey information to beginners in whiskey that you don't necessarily get in one place from books and video channels and whatnot. Today's video is really the third I've made. I haven't even uploaded any of them yet as I'm making the video. But it deals with the question, how do you make whiskey? It may seem obvious to some. When I started drinking whiskey just over a year ago, I didn't know how you make whiskey. And so I want to just kind of rehash it briefly here. And to make whiskey, you start with a mash. Now, that's kind of a technical term, I guess. But if you remember, or if you've even seen the second video, the one I did just before this, what is whiskey, I defined it as an alcoholic drink distilled from a mash of grain. And that's the kicker. You can make vodka from anything. You can make gin from anything. You make brandy from wine or from fruit. Whiskey comes from grain. And the way you do that is you make a mash with it. You can either sprout or not sprout the grain, wheat, rye, barley, corn, whatever it is. Barley, usually they sprout what they call malting. The other grains, they don't usually, although in the United States we have what they call rye malt whiskey. But whether you sprout it or you don't sprout it, you grind it and cook it in water. And the distillers have temperatures and times that they go by. Then when it's cooled, you throw some yeast in there, or sometimes there are some distillers which just let natural airborne yeast get into it. And the yeast commences to eat the sugar that's in the ground up grain. And that's why you can sprout the grain, because as long as you stop the process soon enough, turns all the starch in that grain to sugar, thus increasing the food for the yeast. Yeast eats the sugar and produces two main byproducts. One is carbon dioxide, and so a mash that's working will bubble like it's boiling, even though it's not boiling. The other byproduct is alcohol. That's a waste product of yeast. Then when the yeast has finished eating all the sugar, the mash has worked off, and you can take the liquid, what they call distiller's beer, and there are other names for it, wash in Scotland and Ireland, but you take that distiller's beer, you put it in a still. Now, what's a still? There are many different shapes and sizes, and two main kinds of stills, a pot still and a column still. But it's an apparatus for heating that beer just enough so that the alcohol evaporates, leaving the water behind. Alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water. Water boils at sea level at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Alcohol boils, and I've seen different figures, somewhere around 170 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit, so at a lower temperature than water. And so the alcohol vapors rise up in the still. If you have a pot still, they go into the line arm, which then goes into the condenser, where it condenses back into liquid, and out comes alcohol. And depending on exactly how you're doing it, you can get anywhere from 100 proof to 100 plus, almost 200 proof alcohol at the end of it. But sometimes they'll double distill it or triple distill it. If it's a column still, that vapor rises up and meets plates at various heights in the still, and different uh, sorts of alcohol condense at different temperatures, and so it comes off at various heights in the still, and it's a more complicated but more efficient process than a pot still. So you've made your mash, it's worked off, you've distilled it, the alcohol's come out at the end, and you have yourself a bunch of alcohol. And we're going to say, just for grins and giggles, that it's 120 proof, which I might even make a video about this, I don't know. But in the United States, proof is double the alcohol by volume. So 120 proof divided by 2 is 60% alcohol by volume. And for most American whiskey, the highest proof you can put it in the barrel is 125 proof. But say you've got alcohol 120 proof, 60% alcohol by volume, and you put it in a barrel. Legally, for most kinds of whiskey, you have to put it in a barrel, and it's got to be oak, according to American law and regulations. Now, I've heard of what they call 10-second bourbon. You put it in the barrel, you turn the barrel over and dump it. The whiskey hasn't changed at all, but because it was in a new charred oak barrel, it's legally bourbon now. But the purpose of putting the whiskey in the barrel is to age it. And with some kinds of whiskey, you have to have a new charred oak barrel. Other kinds, you have to have either a used charred oak barrel or a new uncharred barrel. Some kinds of whiskey, you can use whatever you want. There's a category just called American whiskey. You can use whatever barrel you want. But it goes into the barrel, you put that in a warehouse, and over time and the change of the seasons, the whiskey moves into the wood and out of the wood, and it picks up flavor and color from that time in the barrel. Alcohol coming off the still is pure clear, clearer, and I think, than even water. It's the time in the barrel that gives it most of the flavor, gives it all of the color. And you get a good bourbon, it's going to have a nice dark color to it. It'll have the flavors from the wood like vanilla and bananas, in addition to the flavors of corn and the spice from the rye and the sweetness from the wheat or the barley. And it all comes together, and at the end of that, however long you age it, remember, you can age it 10 seconds, you can age it 10 days, you can age it 10 months, and how long you really want to age it depends on the climate. In Scotland and Ireland, where it's a cool climate without many drastic temperature swings, they can get whiskey out of a barrel that's been sitting in the warehouse 60 years, and it's good whiskey. In Kentucky and Tennessee, which for years was where almost all American whiskey come from, 95% of all bourbon still comes from Kentucky. And I'm going to do a video about what bourbon is, but I'll tell you right now, bourbon is whiskey. If you're asking, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Bourbon is whiskey. It's a kind of whiskey. But in Kentucky and Tennessee, the climate is more dramatic, and a 60-year-old whiskey there would be so oaky you couldn't drink it. About the highest you're going to find is 20-year whiskey, or maybe a little more. One of the most expensive and hard to find bottles is Pappy Van Winkle 23-year bourbon. You get down into Texas, where my favorite whiskey comes from, and their climate is so hot in the summer, so cold in the winter, with such wide and frequent temperature swings, that you get good bourbon after just 3 or 4 years. But whenever the whiskey's ready, you dump the barrel, you do whatever else you need to, put in water to proof it down to where you want to sell it at. Uh, you put it in your bottle, you slap a label on, and it goes out to the store, and you buy it, and you have yourself a bottle of whiskey. In fact, I have a bottle of whiskey here. I just picked this up yesterday. I don't see the camera because I'm looking at my notes on the screen. But this is Knob Creek. What do they call it? Knob Creek Kentucky State Bourbon Whiskey. It's a 9-year-old whiskey, 9 years in the barrel. And it's pretty fine bourbon. I wasn't sure I was going to like it because when I started drinking whiskey, I tried some Knob Creek, and I didn't think it was all that great. But now I'm better able to deal with it, better able to evaluate and understand it. But that's whiskey. They distilled it from a mash of grain, uh, corn, of course, because it's a bourbon, and whatever else that was in there. They mashed in, they waited for it to work off. They took the distiller's beer, put it in a still, distilled it into alcohol, put that in a barrel. The barrel sat in the warehouse 9 years, and there might be older whiskeys than that. The age statement on a label is the youngest whiskey that's in there. So if they say they had a batch of 1,000 barrels and 3 of those barrels were 9 years old, the rest were older, 10, 12, whatever, the age statement then is 9 years. But it went into the barrel, it picked up the color and the flavor, went into the bottle, and there we have Knob Creek bourbon. That is a very basic explanation of how you make whiskey. But when I was a beginner, that's all I needed was a basic explanation. Hopefully this basic explanation will do the trick for you. And thus ends another thoroughly amateur production on the Whiskey for Beginners channel.